Welcome to the Blockade Runner podcast. My name is John, and I'm going to be doing a solo show today and talking just a little bit about the Star Wars Rise of Skywalker visual dictionary. And we've done a couple episodes about the Rise of Skywalker so far, and kind of given our initial impressions. And then Chris and I did an episode where we were playing Star Wars Triple Pursuit and just talking about the movie, which was fun to record anyways. Hopefully it was fun to listen to. And we'll keep talking Star Wars, or keep talking the Rise of Skywalker in the coming months, I'm sure, as well. But there's a lot of good stuff in the visual dictionary, and I thought that was a subject that I could kind of tackle on the show in a little bit of a shorter episode. So since I'm doing it on my own, definitely, I'm going to try to keep it a little bit on the shorter side. But just kind of talk about some of the stuff that I found compelling in the visual dictionary, and a little bit more about the Rise of Skywalker. So before we jump into it, just wanted to talk about the visual dictionaries in general a little bit, and also kind of the perspective that I've heard some people have about the Rise of Skywalker visual dictionary as well. So the visual dictionary concept, it has been around, being published by DK for quite a while now. They actually did the first one in 98, and it covered the original trilogy. And then they put one out for each of the prequels, and there's been one for all of the Disney Star Wars movies as well. So they've been going strong here, DK, with the Star Wars visual dictionaries for quite a while. And being published by DK, they are, I think, focused on a younger audience for sure. It's a primarily visual book. I mean, there's a lot of text as well, but lots of fun images, and kind of the layout and the sort of the aesthetic of it is similar to the DK sticker books as well, which I think are really fun. So definitely kind of in that mold, that DK mold for Star Wars books for kids, but kind of very informative, but also a focus on the images for sure. So but I mean, they just like kind of break down all the weaponry, the costumes, aliens, planets, all that stuff. I'm sure you've read a Star Wars visual dictionary before, but I know that a lot of listeners, viewers, whatever, pick these up. But then just like even some of my friends who are giant Star Wars fans and love the movies and the cartoons, and even read some of the like comics and video games and stuff like that, they don't necessarily grab the visual dictionary. So part of me was thinking about doing this episode, and I thought, well, people can read the visual dictionary themselves. They don't really need me to talk about it on the podcast. But at the same time, it's just like, I know there's lots of fans that, for whatever reason, don't necessarily pick up the visual dictionary. So definitely a lot more people have seen The Rise of Skywalker than will grab this visual dictionary. So I'm just going to talk about some of my favorite parts from it, and I would definitely encourage you to grab a copy if you find the stuff that I covered today from the Rise of Skywalker visual dictionary. If you find that interesting, I would definitely encourage you to pick it up, because I'm just going to touch the surface of what's in there. So yeah, and the other thing I wanted to talk about is just kind of like, what is the purpose of these visual dictionary books? I mean, we I covered the fact that they're for kids, I think, and they are targeted towards that audience. But the other thing that's the big deal for me with the Star Wars visual dictionaries is, like, once I go see a new Star Wars movie, multiple times even, that 2.5 hour experience, it's like, I want more than that, right? So I want to live in that world a little more than what the movie allows you to do. And so it's fun to just grab these visual dictionaries and then, learn more about the aliens, the planets, the weaponry, etc. And just kind of like soak in the story a little more, and soak in the world a little bit more. So I think that's the purpose of it. With The Rise of Skywalker specifically, because, so many people feel like the movie is like super packed and there's so much going on in the movie. I've heard the complaint floating around out there that, well, the movie doesn't make sense unless you grab the visual dictionary, and, they're depending on people to read this visual dictionary to kind of understand the movie. And that's something I just don't agree with personally. To me, this visual dictionary is very much like all the visual dictionaries for, the other Star Wars movies that they've released these for. And, I guess the opposite side of that argument is like, well, the visual dictionaries are the same, but the movie's not the same. This movie, there's too much going on that hasn't been explained or something like that. And again, I hear that complaint. It makes sense. But I just personally don't really think that's the case. I mean, I think it's, I think it's just like all Star Wars movies. There's lots of things that are not necessarily explained that are kind of hinted at. And the thing that Pablo does with these visual dictionaries is he goes in and he kind of mines those references, and he mines the plot points and the things that are in the movies that they're not really fit to be explored in detail in a movie. The movie's there to tell a story, and one of the reasons that I do love Star Wars is that I think primarily it's there to tell a story about the characters and the human beings in Star Wars, and not so much about, how stormtrooper units were developed, or, how the technology of a Wayfinder works. Like, I don't need that in a Star Wars movie, but I love to be able to pick up a book and read about that kind of stuff, so I think the movies can focus, by necessity, focus only on the essential components, and they only have to explain things enough that it makes sense, and on like a basic level. And then a visual dictionary or something like that is there for you to kind of jump in and just kind of learn more at your, as you desire. So I think that's the purpose of the visual dictionary. I think that's been the purpose of the visual dictionary since they started releasing them. And, I understand that, some audience members or whatever would like to have the movie explain more of this stuff for them, and that maybe The Rise of Skywalker in particular, because it's kind of like, no question, it is a very packed movie. Some people feel like they needed to pack it a little more with some of these details, but just the experience of reading The Rise of Skywalker visual dictionary and going through it, it felt very much like going through all the other visual dictionaries, and that there's lots of stuff in every Star Wars movie that needs a little more explanation. Or I shouldn't say that it needs it, but when you do read about it and you read about some of these components in more detail, then they make more sense. So that's my take on kind of the purpose of these visual dictionaries. And I'm going to, I think, talk about a bunch of stuff that's really interesting that's in this visual dictionary. But for me, it's just like fleshing out some of the stuff that is already in the movie. And, the reason I find the stuff compelling that I pulled out is because of, its presence in the movie and, just learning a little more about it. Okay, so one of the first things that I was going to cover is the fact that the timeline laid out in the front of this visual dictionary is centered around the Star Killer incident. So, in other words, the end of The Force Awakens. And usually these timelines or whatever are the origin date, the thing that the rest of the timeline revolves around is the Battle of Yavin. So I've seen, some frustration about the fact that this visual dictionary changes that, and some discontent or some concern that maybe what this means is that like Disney is now resetting the timeline, and before, when the Battle of Yavin was sacred, now the Star Killer incident is taking precedence over that or whatever. And I just think that's like not really reality. I think that what we have here is a book that is about the movie The Rise of Skywalker, which is the third movie in the sequel trilogy era. And so when you want things to be relatable to this trilogy of movies, these three movies, it makes sense to anchor them around the Star Killer incident. And now that the three movies, the trilogy, the sequel trilogy is done, there's no reason to be coy about it anymore because the story's laid out for the sequel trilogy. And so I think it just makes sense. I don't think this means that like forever and always in all Star Wars media, the Star Killer incident is now the new most important thing. I don't think there needs to be a most important thing. I don't think there needs to be like a, year zero for Star Wars going forward forever. And to me, it's just like, it's such a non-issue. It doesn't really matter, except for that it makes a ton of sense to organize a book like this around the Star Killer incident, because that is sort of like the first, huge moment in the sequel trilogy era. One of the things that I think is really cool in The Rise of Skywalker and is not explained in detail is the Sith Eternal concept. And so the visual dictionary goes into that a little bit, still not a ton. And I think it's because it's sort of a general concept and not one that's, super detailed or whatever. But I do hear a lot of people coming out of the movie saying, or people I talk to or whatever, I don't like stand outside the movie theater waiting for people to come out and tell me what they thought. Although that could be interesting. I do hear a lot of people after seeing The Rise of Skywalker saying like, what's the deal with all those hooded people in the like Sith, arena stadium thing on Exegol? And, what is the deal? I don't know. But we know from the visual dictionary and from some of the comments, I think from like JJ and Chris Terrio and stuff like that, that there is this group called the Sith Eternal. And the Sith Eternal, as far as I can tell from the visual dictionary, is this group of cultists. They're Sith followers, and they are not Sith themselves in the sense that they're not like, dark force users or whatever, but they are there to assist the Sith, and I think their goal, at least in the sphere of The Rise of Skywalker, is to like help Palpatine come back and help the Sith like regain power. So they have their own little symbol there, the Sith Eternal symbol. It's on the like stone treasure box thing that Kylo opens up in the beginning of the movie. That's the Sith Eternal kind of logo or emblem or whatever. But yeah, it's an organization that was clearly created, for this movie and for The Rise of Skywalker, and probably not something they had in mind previously, but I really like it. I think it's cool because it gives this kind of creepy occult vibe to the whole Sith thing. And, Exegol, if it was just like an empty planet with just Palpatine there in his robot throne thing, that'd be okay. But I kind of like the fact that there's all these like, dark figures and hoods creeping around. So that's what the Sith Eternal is. Along those same lines, the opening planet in the movie where Kylo finds the Wayfinder at the start of the movie is Mustafar. And I know a lot of people, that's been talked about a lot. I think a lot of people recognize or understand now that is Mustafar at the beginning of the movie. But the visual dictionary makes that clear, and that's where he is. In fact, the visual dictionary points out that not only is he on Mustafar, but he's at Vader's castle on Mustafar. And it is a disappointment that we didn't get to, kind of really feel that and know that from watching the movie. Because I think, there's ways that they could have more clearly indicated that that's where we are. But I do think that it's cool to read about that kind of thing in the visual dictionary. It's cool to find out that is Mustafar, where he is. And in fact, it's the crumbling ruins of Vader's castle. I question why they weren't able to kind of like more clearly represent that visually in the film. And I wonder if that's a deleted scene type thing. I'm sure in the concept phase that was all laid out, and even the script probably acknowledges that that's where, or makes clear that that's where Kylo is. And so, yeah, it's a bummer that it's not more obvious in the movie. But I know I'm not everybody agrees with this, and that's cool, but I kind of like the snappy kind of structure of the beginning of the movie. Like I love the way Kylo picks up that Wayfinder, and then it just kind of like transitions into the shot of the TIE fighter flying to Exegol, and it's like this visual storytelling that makes it clear, like, hey, that thing he found is the map that gets him there, without having to spend a lot of time like clarifying that. So I like that scene still. I think it's cool, and this is one of those instances where having the visual dictionary definitely kind of makes it it makes that scene better. So on the topic of Wayfinders, another thing that is clarified in the visual dictionary is that Luke actually learns about the Wayfinders in his studying of the sacred texts that are on Ahch-To. And this is one of those things, too, where you have to kind of do some, you got to kind of think about that for a second, because, you watch The Last Jedi and you think, like, have those sacred texts always been there in that tree on Ahch-To? Did Luke go to Ahch-To and find the secret texts? But I think that the visual dictionary makes it clear that that's not the case. But I think even just paying attention to the movies, it does make sense that that's actually not what the deal is. The deal is that Luke, in between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, was traveling around the galaxy and finding different artifacts like the compass that's in The Last Jedi, the sacred texts. We find out in The Rise of Skywalker that he and Lando went to Pisana on Ochi's trail, and that they were looking for the Wayfinder and information about the Wayfinder, that kind of stuff. So there is, I think, enough in The Last Jedi and in The Rise of Skywalker to indicate that, yeah, like Luke was going around, he was collecting things. So then it follows kind of logically that the sacred texts are could fit into that and be things that he found. And I think that's what the story is supposed to be, is that he was collecting those sacred texts as he was exploring the galaxy, looking for Jedi artifacts and that kind of thing, and more history about the Jedi Order. And then when he went to Ahch-To, he kind of placed those texts there. Although, doesn't he say in The Last Jedi that library has stood for 1,000 years? So maybe he adds some texts to the library. But in any case, I believe he's supposed to have been like kind of traversing the galaxy, finding this stuff, and he found some information about the Wayfinders. And actually, he's been adding to the sacred text too, which is weird because they're sacred. But I guess he's been adding to the sacred text as he goes too. So yeah. The pages on Exegol are probably some of the most interesting. Obviously, that's one of the parts of the movie that is most mysterious, and so it's definitely, I think a lot of people probably get the visual dictionary and go straight to like the Sith Trooper stuff and the Exegol stuff. There's not really anything about Palpatine, which is a little bit of a bummer, but the Exegol stuff is probably what people kind of go straight to, and there's some great stuff in there. And specifically, I thought it was really interesting the discussion of the knife that Ochi used to kill Rey's parents, and that Rey uses to find the Wayfinder and the Death Star, which is another pretty controversial thing in the movie. I mean, I think it's pretty goofy, and I think it's fun because it's pulpy personally, but I totally understand the argument that it's pretty illogical and sort of defies belief, that knife would exist and that it would actually work in the way it's intended to work. So I get that, but, faking in space and all that. So I'm pretty into it. But the discussion of it here says, this is on page 54 of the Visual Dictionary, this Sith Eternal incantation carved in the old tongue, which, I mean, that's creepy right there, the old tongue. Carved in the old tongue denotes the nature of the dyad appearing in the Force. Curiously, it's nearly identical to the text describing the Rule of Two, a Sith doctrine that there can only be 2 living Sith lords, but inflection marks and line breaks change specific meaning in certain words. I think that is a pretty fun way to kind of decode the text on the knife, to say that, hey, the Sith, their old tongue, their language, and in their incantation, this like ceremony, or like this ritual that's apparently inscribed, or part of what's inscribed on the knife, would focus on the Rule of Two, but that language is like extremely close to discussion of the dyad concept as well. So it's just kind of a way of taking like that Rule of Two thing and inverting it, or kind of looking at it from a different angle when it comes to Rey and Kylo, which, the dyad thing is, and it's not really explored too much more in the Visual Dictionary, the concept of the dyad. I kind of personally feel like, hey, they're connected through the Force, they're kind of like their destinies are intertwined, and that's all I really need to know. I don't really need to get into the logistics of it. And I guess the Visual Dictionary probably agrees, because Pablo didn't try to come up with any real specific explanation of what the dyad is. But, like, they're connected. It's something that only happens every couple generations, maybe if that. It's a pretty big deal. And, that's about what I need to know about it. So another pretty kind of, I guess, controversial component of The Rise of Skywalker is the fact that that Poe is, presented as having been part of the Spice Runners of Kijimi with Zori Bliss, and that he, spent time kind of, involved in that illegal activity. And the controversial part of it is the fact that the Poe Dameron comic, I think, and just like the established canon in the comics and the novels and that kind of thing, had, Poe's story had been that he was part of the Old Republic Navy, and then he joined the Resistance. And so, a lot of people felt like, hey, this really kind of contradicts the established story that was already out there. So the way that the Visual Dictionary explains that is that when Poe was a teenager, he had a falling out with his father, and in a rebellious act, he ran off to the planet of Kijimi and spent a year or two or something like that with the Spice Runners on Kijimi. And then he left them, and he returned to his home planet, and then he joined the New Republic Navy, and like that's the storyline for Poe Dameron. So I got to be honest with you, I assume that what that means is that J.J. Abrams didn't read the comics or books, or either that or he, decided that he preferred this Spice Runner background for Poe. And then Pablo figured out how to make it work. And, this is one of those situations where, like, I really don't think that it's in the movie that Poe, had a rebellious period and went to Kajimi, and then he went back and joined the Navy, and then he joined the Resistance. Like, that's not really in the movie per se, but I don't think the movie, there's nothing in the movie that would make that implausible or whatever. So I think it's a case where, like, Pablo deserves the credit here, because Pablo is probably the one who came up with this concept and figured out that this is what the story should be to make it work with JJ and Chris Terrio's concept. And at the end of the day, I think it works well. It works fine. And so, if you were really upset when you saw the movie and you say, hey, that's not what I read about in the Poe Dameron comics or whatever, like, they're undoing things. Truthfully, I mean, they probably didn't pay close enough attention to not undo that, but I think Pablo came in and saved the day, and, going forward, this is like the canon version of it, and so it all kind of worked out, maybe thanks to Pablo's, ability to kind of navigate those two things and fit them together. Beaumont Kin. Not my favorite part of The Rise of Skywalker. I felt like he was kind of awkward. I felt like he was an unnecessary character. Hey, the movie is packed with tons of content and characters, and there's so much story that needs to be told. Do we really need a new character there? Now, granted, he's not much of a character. I mean, he's just a guy sitting there, kind of like stating plot points, sort of giving us that expository dialogue every once in a while. So you didn't really need to develop him too much. So, I mean, I guess there's the argument that it's okay to have him because you didn't have to spend any time developing him. But, I agree with a lot of people who would argue that Rose could have, had all those lines, and that Rose was underused in the movie. And did we really need JJ's buddy Dominic Moynihan to be in the movie as Beaumont Kin? And, personally, I would say no. But, again, Pablo's job in making the visual dictionary is to kind of add to the characters and the story and the worlds and all that. And so the way Pablo's done that with the visual dictionary is to explain that Beaumont Kin is a professor, a historian, somebody who's really knowledgeable in like the history of the Jedi and the Sith, and then he knows some of these ancient languages and that sort of thing. Now, I guess that could have been in the script. That could be from JJ and Chris Terrio, and I'm giving the credit to Pablo, and really, those guys were involved too. That's very possible, makes sense also, but, I just kind of get the feeling that, like, Pablo looked at the movie and thought, who's this Beaumont Kin guy, and did he really need to be in it? Kind of came up with an explanation for why Beaumont Kin was special or unique or whatever. So whether it was Pablo or whether actually, the filmmakers themselves are the ones who kind of came up with this storyline for Beaumont Kin, that's why he's there. He has that expertise, and he's the only one in the Resistance that has it, I guess, or to that degree. So, that doesn't really work that well for me because I still just don't really like him or need him in the movie, and I'd rather have Rose, delivering most of those lines. But, it's the visual dictionary, I guess, kind of helps, again, kind of mend that situation or kind of create a bridge where it makes a little more sense. Another much talked about topic that is directly from the Star Wars Rise of Skywalker visual dictionary is the whole Lando's daughter being abducted situation, and the connection between that and Jannah, and whether or not those two things are connected. So if you haven't read the visual dictionary and you haven't been paying attention to some of the conversation about that online or whatever, the visual dictionary does make it clear that Lando, after the events of the original trilogy, started a family, had a daughter, and that his daughter was abducted by the First Order. Okay. After that is when he was with Luke traveling to Pisana, in other places, I'm sure, but that they chased Ochi to Pisana, and then Lando stuck around on Pisana, partially because, his family, he didn't have a family anymore, and, he was kind of lost or whatever. Okay. So that all, works for me. That all just works for me. I like that. Jannah's story is that, like most or all stormtroopers in the First Order, she was abducted from a family she'll never know, as Finn says. And, then she rebels and leaves the First Order, has a mutiny or whatever. So those are two separate things as they're presented in the movie. Actually, the whole thing with Lando having a daughter is not presented in the movie at all, but, Lando's story and Jannah's story are separate in the movie. And the only time that they come together is at the very end of the movie. And what I think is a very sweet moment, a moment I really enjoy at the end of the movie when Jannah explains to Lando that she doesn't know what planet she's from. She doesn't know who she is. And Lando looks at her and says, well, let's go find out, and I like that moment. And I think that's all that it needs to be. So the question is then what's kind of going on in the visual dictionary, or what's going on in the larger canon version of this story? Because in the visual dictionary, Jannah is presented as somebody who obviously was stolen as a baby from her family by the First Order, but Lando is presented as somebody whose daughter was stolen by the First Order as well. And so then I think there's some suggestion, I guess, from the visual dictionary that perhaps those two things are not completely separate, or that, I guess, rather than dance around it, I guess there's some suggestion from the visual dictionary that Jannah is Lando's missing daughter. I don't know what to think about this one, except for that my feeling is that if that was something they considered doing, that is not something that they decided to do. That would be a huge plot point, and it would be something that I don't think they would just explain in the visual dictionary, and the visual dictionary doesn't even come out and explain it. So is it a situation where they want to leave it vague and then they're going to explore it in a story down the road? Possibly. I kind of hope not myself. I love the moment between Lando and Jannah at the end of the movie as it is. I love it because it's Lando just wanting to be helpful. It's Lando being a mentor figure, and it's Lando being kind, and so I like it as it is. I don't need every single little thing to be connected. That moment between them at the end of the movie, knowing that Lando had a daughter who was abducted, knowing that Jannah is somebody's daughter who was abducted, I think it adds a little, if you read the visual dictionary, if you're somebody who pays attention to all this kind of ancillary stuff, it adds a little something to it. But I think to take that to, it adds a little something to it, and what it adds is that she's his daughter is like too much, I don't think it is, that's verified by the visual dictionary. I don't think there's enough in the visual dictionary to kind of make that argument. But more than that, I don't like it. I don't like it. And so I think that it's probably something that was considered, but I think definitely the better choice is for them to be, people that have in some way similar stories, and, the circumstances brought them together, and maybe they can help each other and be there for each other, but they don't have to be related. So that's what I would prefer. A couple more things. One thing that I thought was fun, and this is for sure a Pablo thing, but there's a portion of the visual dictionary about the Jungle X Hopper, which is like this ship that's on the Resistance base, and it was designed by Rose, according to the visual dictionary, and Rose sometimes refers to it as a mini rig, according to the visual dictionary, which is a nice little touch, and for sure, like I said, I'm pretty sure that's a Pablo thing. Seems very much like a Pablo thing. Ochi of Bestoon, another super interesting component of the movie. I thought, again, you don't get the whole backstory of Ochi of Bestoon. I don't need the whole backstory. I get plenty. But there's some more stuff in the visual dictionary, which I think is fun. Number one, it points out that he worked with Yup Tashu, which is one of the Emperor's creepy dudes. I think he's the one in purple, right? So one of the Emperor's dignitaries or whatever. I thought that was a cool little touch. He's a member of the Acolytes of Beyond, which is something that was, I think, first mentioned in the Aftermath books, if I'm not mistaken. I've read all those books. I remember there were some of the interstitial chapters that addressed those Acolytes of Beyond. So that's a nice little touch. He's not a Force user, but he is somebody who's like dedicated to the Sith. So he'd be part of that Sith Eternal kind of cult or whatever. And the visual dictionary points out that he believes the murders that he carries out are in service of the dark side and kind of contribute to the power of the dark side. So I thought that was cool too. Oh, Vader's helmet. Vader's helmet, according to the visual dictionary, never replied to Kylo. So when Kylo is saying, hey, grandfather, show me the dark side again or whatever, according to the way it's described in the visual dictionary, that was an exercise in frustration for Kylo. My words, not the visual dictionary, but that he never actually received any communication from the helmet. That he had voices in his head that were always there, dark side influence throughout his life, or I guess, in the latter years of his life. And Palpatine tells us in the movie that was him manipulating Kylo. But, I would have thought like, hey, the movie tells you that, Palpatine says I was every voice that was ever in your head, and even uses Vader's voice. So it just kind of makes sense that would be happening with the helmet too. But for whatever reason, the argument, according to the visual dictionary, is that is not the case. So surprising, but it doesn't really matter to me. Just it's kind of an odd choice, I thought. Just a few more things. Kef Bir is one of the 9 moons that orbit Endor, and that's something that like the movie doesn't super like clarify. Hey, this is near Endor, and that's why the Death Star wreckage is on it. Again, I don't need that. I wasn't even clear from Return of the Jedi whether or not the the forest moon of Endor was called Endor, or if it was a moon of Endor. These things don't have to be explained in detail. And Kef Bir is a planet that some Death Star wreckage lands on. It makes sense to assume it's near Endor, and it turns out it is a moon of Endor, just like the forest moon of Endor. And sort of last thing, that's kind of like new information from The Rise of Skywalker that is in the visual dictionary, is just a little bit more about the Sith Troopers. So I think in traditional Star Wars fashion, it was kind of like a big deal made about the Sith Troopers leading up to it. So there's a lot of times where there'll be like a new trooper design or some kind of new, like the Knights of Ren in The Force Awakens, like, oh, it seems like it's going to be such a big deal, and then it turns out to be kind of a small thing. And that was certainly the case with The Rise of Skywalker and the Sith Troopers. They're not in the movie that much, and the movie doesn't really explain too much as to what they are. We just know that they're kind of like the First Order troops that have been on Exegol, with the Sith Eternal cult or whatever, and that they've been there with Palpatine and they're loyal to Palpatine, etc. But I guess essentially the way the story breaks out is that there's a portion of the First Order that's like a secret portion of the First Order that is really only known to Palpatine and the chosen few that are like kind of in on that whole. One of the really cool things with the Sith Troopers in the movie is when towards the end, when Rey is confronting Palpatine, there are like some special looking Sith Troopers that are kind of like very much like the Royal Guards from Return of the Jedi, and those are called the Sovereign Protectors according to the visual dictionary. So again, I'm sure Pablo just came up with that name, but clearly the movie has these specific Sith Troopers that are there to guard the Emperor, and so I was into that. Also, another thing that I know a lot of fans are super into in the visual dictionary is the fact that there are legions of troopers in the Sith Trooper organization that are named after ancient Sith lords, and one of those legions is called the Revan Legion. So as far as I know, that's the first time Revan has really been mentioned in this new canon or whatever, and so it's a nice kind of nod to that history. And then I think some people are hoping an indication that Revan could be involved in storytelling going forward, which I'm sure he could be and likely will be involved in some of that stuff. So that was cool too. And I think very last thing from the visual dictionary that I'm going to touch on is that the Sith fleet personnel, like all the other Sith troopers. So we have the Sith troopers, but then there's also like the fleet personnel that are manning the Star Destroyers and stuff like that. The Sith troopers and those Sith fleet personnel were all raised on Exegol. And not only were they raised on Exegol, but they were raised as the children of Sith Eternal cultists. So it adds a whole creepy factor to it, the fact that they've like lived their whole lives on this creepy Sith planet, and that they were being raised ostensibly by the people in the hoods, like in the stadium. So just weird culty Sith people raised those Sith troopers and that Sith fleet personnel. So Yeah. I don't know. It's one of my favorite things about The Rise of Skywalker in terms of like what's explored in the visual dictionary, kind of more so than the movie, is the whole Sith Eternal, Sith cult type thing. Again, I know some people probably felt like that should have been explored more so in the movie, like in more detail. I like that it's like this weird, creepy thing that's in the movie. And like, who are these guys in the stadium and why are they all wearing hoods, and who connected Palpatine to the big like robot arm that carries him around and fills him up with, green stuff to keep him alive. I think that is the kind of thing that's best served in a visual dictionary. And it's also one of the things that makes me want to go out and get a visual dictionary, because it's like, hey, what's the deal with that weird culty Sith stuff in The Rise of Skywalker? So, yeah, overall, the visual dictionary is lots of fun and packed with content, as always. This one even has some behind-the-scenes stuff at the end, although it is pretty slight. It's pretty small. But, yeah, I mean, I always love the visual dictionaries. This one is, bigger and has also cross-sections in it, which those used to be a separate book. And I'm guessing those didn't sell as well, so now they've included some cross-sections in this Rise of Skywalker visual dictionary. So, yeah, it's great. It's really cool. And if you're somebody who had problems with The Rise of Skywalker, I guess the visual dictionary could explain some of that stuff away or make it a little more palatable to you. To me, that's not really the purpose of it. To me, it's more like, hey, I want to learn more about this stuff, and it'll be fun to kind of read about it. But it's, as most of this stuff is for me anyways, kind of separate from the movie. So, all right, well, that's going to do it for our look at the Rise of Skywalker visual dictionary. Thanks very much for watching and or listening to the show. You can find everything we do at blockaderunnerpodcast.com. All the previous shows we've done are there. Future shows will be there. A few blog posts, stuff like that. So, yeah, everything's at blockaderunnerpodcast.com. You can follow us on Twitter at blockaderun. And we'd love to hear from you. If you have thoughts you want to share on the visual dictionary or just the Rise of Skywalker in general, that's at blockaderunnerpodcast@gmail.com. So thanks again for watching and or listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of the show.